December 1944. Europe was suffocating under its fourth winter of war. Snow fell in sheets so thick that even sound seemed frozen in the air. The forests of the Ardennes were white, still, and deathly quiet until, without warning, that silence broke. From the eastern horizon came the growl of engines. First faint, then thunderous. At dawn on December 16, the German army unleashed what would become its final great offensive of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. More than 200,000 men surged through the fog-filled woods toward the thinly held American lines. In the first days, chaos reigned. Communication lines were cut, roads choked with snow and retreating convoys, entire regiments swallowed by the forest before headquarters even knew they were gone. Among those scattered units was Sergeant Roddie Edmonds, a 26-year-old Tennessee native serving with the 106th Infantry Division. He had arrived in Europe only weeks earlier, one of thousands of fresh soldiers sent to hold what was thought to be a quiet sector of the Western Front. His men were green, untested, and badly outnumbered. They had been told the war was nearly over. It was not. On December 17, German panzers of the 5th Panzer Army broke through near Schönberg. Artillery shattered the snow-covered ridgelines, and within hours the 106th Division was encircled. American shells were soon exhausted, radios useless. The dense pine forest muffled commands and trapped the smoke of burning trucks in a gray haze. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense but a slow collapse, isolated pockets of men surrounded by armor they could not stop. In one of those pockets, Sergeant Edmonds kept his platoon together, refusing to abandon the wounded or to flee alone. His training had been ordinary, his courage, invisible, quiet, the kind that emerged only when everything else had failed. For 2 days, he led his men through shell bursts and blinding snow, trying to break west toward St. Vith. But every path seemed to end with the black cross of a German tank or the guttural shout of an advancing infantry line. By the third day, ammunition was gone. Their rifles hung uselessly at their sides. Surrender was not a choice but a physical inevitability. At dawn, surrounded near the village of Meyerode, Edmonds and hundreds of others were ordered to lay down their arms. Machine guns stood watch as they were stripped of watches, rations, and anything resembling warmth. For the first time since landing in Europe, Edmonds realized that the war he had trained for, the one of strategy, duty, and victory parades, was over for him. What lay ahead would be survival, measured not in battles won, but in breaths endured. The prisoners were herded into columns and marched eastward. Snow came to their knees. The wounded stumbled and were pushed along by rifle butts. For many, the march became a blur of frozen nights and footsteps that left no trace because the wind erased them as they fell. In the distance, Allied artillery still boomed like a memory of power. Yet here, among the captured, silence returned, the kind that hollows men out from within. As they crossed the Aue River into Germany, Edmonds counted the days by the pale sun, though it rarely appeared. He began keeping mental notes of those around him, who was sick, who still had a coat, who needed help standing when the guards looked away. Leadership, in those moments, was not a speech or a command, it was a hand under an elbow, a whisper to keep walking when someone's legs refused. The Germans were efficient. Prisoners were sorted, documented, and sent by train to camps deep inside the Reich. The cattle cars were unheated, sealed except for a slit at the top. Breath froze to walls, forming thin crusts of ice. Men huddled together for warmth, pressing shoulder to shoulder, counting each tunnel by the echo it made against the iron wheels. Somewhere near Koblenz, an air raid forced the train to a halt. The guards locked the doors and fled to the ditches while Allied planes roared overhead. The prisoners sat helpless, knowing that liberation might come in the form of their own destruction. The bombs missed, but the concussion shook the cars so violently that for a moment Edmonds thought the walls might give way. When silence returned, it felt almost holy. Days later, the doors opened to reveal a landscape of gray fields and skeletal trees. They had arrived at Stalag 9A, near Ziegenhain in central Germany, a sprawling prisoner-of-war camp designed for several thousand men, but already swollen beyond capacity. Barbed wire in triple rows encircled the compound, punctuated by wooden guard towers where machine guns glinted behind frosted glass. Here, Edmonds would spend the final months of the war. Inside the camp, order was an illusion. Hunger ruled everything. Prisoners exchanged buttons for bread, cigarettes for a sip of watery soup. Lice crawled through seams, and the cold gnawed through every layer of clothing. Yet beneath the surface misery, there was also a quiet structure, the military instinct to form ranks even in captivity. Sergeants became spokesmen, officers organized work details, and the faint rhythm of army discipline flickered within the chaos. Edmonds, as the highest-ranking non-commissioned officer among the newly arrived Americans, assumed responsibility for them. It was a title without reward, only burden. Every complaint, every punishment, every missing ration came through him. But he accepted it without protest. He began keeping a small notebook, hidden in his boot, where he recorded names, units, and dates. Not as a diary of suffering, but as a record proof that these men had existed, that their dignity had not been erased by the wire around them. Nights were the worst. Wind hissed through cracks in the barracks walls, carrying the distant rumble of bombers headed toward cities they could only imagine. Men dreamed of home, of warmth, of silence without fear. Edmonds listened to their stories, their prayers, and when the younger ones broke down, he reminded them that the line had not ended, only shifted. Beyond the fence, Germany was crumbling. The Allies were closing in from both east and west, and inside the Reich the machinery of collapse was grinding to dust. But the camp existed in its own suspended time, cut off from news or hope. Guards grew more nervous, more unpredictable. Orders arrived from Berlin with increasing cruelty, as though brutality itself could hold the war together. One morning in January 1945, word spread that the commandant had received instructions concerning Jewish prisoners. The Germans intended to separate them from the rest of the Americans. No one yet knew what that meant, but in the camp's collective memory lingered the knowledge of what special treatment meant elsewhere. Fear began to move like a current through the barracks. Edmonds understood immediately what was at stake. Many of the men under his charge were Jewish. Some had changed their dog tags to conceal it, scratching away the small h that indicated Hebrew faith. Others had none left to change. In captivity, identity could be both a weapon and a death sentence. That night, Edmonds wrote nothing in his notebook. He simply sat by the dim light of a smuggled candle and listened to the wind. He had no weapon, no plan, no promise of rescue. Only an instinct that leadership did not end when the rifles were gone. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. The same snow that had buried the forests of the Ardennes now drifted against the barbed wire of Stalag 9A. To the guards, it was camouflage; to the prisoners, a reminder that time was still moving, even here. When morning came, a German officer walked through the camp square reading a list of numbers. The order was clear: all Jewish prisoners were to report separately. Silence followed his announcement, a silence thicker than the cold. Edmonds watched the faces around him, saw fear rise and retreat like a tide. Then he stood up. He did not know it yet, but that small act, standing when others were frozen by fear, would lead to one of the quietest and most profound moments of moral courage in the entire war. In a conflict remembered for its firepower, his weapon would be something unseen. Not a rifle or grenade, but the unwavering belief that every man beside him, regardless of faith, wore the same uniform. The white silence of the Ardennes had followed him here. And in that silence, he prepared to defy an empire without firing a single shot. The march east from the Ardennes was not recorded in headlines or maps. It took place on back roads and forest trails, in the hush between artillery barrages, far from the eyes of commanders who still believed the lines were intact. For the men who had fallen into German hands, there was only one direction now: deeper into the Reich. Sergeant Roddie Edmonds moved with the column of prisoners like a ghost in a tide of exhaustion. His boots were torn at the seams, his canteen long empty. Each mile erased another piece of the life he had known, the Tennessee fields, the church bells of home, the sound of English spoken without orders. What replaced it was a gray silence punctuated by the bark of guards and the shuffle of feet in snow. They were herded through shattered villages where the windows gaped like broken teeth. Civilians watched from behind curtains, thin faces framed by the war's endless winter. Sometimes a child waved. Sometimes stones were thrown. In the cold light of afternoon, Edmonds saw the full ruin of Europe, houses burned to their foundations, horses dead in their harness, fields turned to craters. The German army was retreating even as it advanced, fighting for a victory that no longer existed. By night the prisoners slept in barns or open fields. The wounded lay apart, tended by whoever still had the strength to move. Hunger became the measure of time. Each morning began with the same question whispered through cracked lips: "Bread, did you hear bread?" When none came, they walked on. On the third day, the march crossed the Rhine. The bridge was guarded by men who looked barely older than boys, their uniforms patched and eyes hollow. Above them hung the faint drone of Allied aircraft, a distant reminder that liberation was not a dream but a direction. Yet for now it was unreachable, separated by 1,000 miles of barbed wire and the decisions of men they would never meet. When the column finally reached the railhead near Limburg, Edmonds' group was packed into freight cars. The guards slammed the doors and sealed them with wire. The air inside turned to breathfrost and whispers. Hours bled into days. Someone sang a hymn until his voice cracked. Others counted the nails in the floorboards or scratched messages into the wood with belt buckles. At night the temperature dropped below freezing. Men pressed against each other for warmth, trying to forget the smell of sweat and fear. In the darkness Edmonds felt a weight against his shoulder, one of the younger privates, barely 18, murmuring that he couldn't breathe. Edmonds shifted to make space, though there was none. The gesture was useless but human, and that was reason enough. When at last the doors opened, the light was blinding. The prisoners blinked into a landscape of fences, towers, and smoke. This was Germany's interior, a labyrinth of camps built to hold the captured remnants of a world at war. For officers there were camps with books and lectures, for others, only the bare minimum to keep men alive. They marched again, this time through the gates of Stalag 9A near Ziegenhain. Behind the wire lay thousands of uniforms from a dozen nations: Americans, Britons, Poles, French, and Russians. Languages mingled like currents in the frozen air, all joined by the single vocabulary of survival. The Americans were housed in a row of wooden barracks roofed with tar paper. Inside, bunks were stacked 3 high, straw-filled mattresses crawling with lice. A single stove stood cold in the corner, its fuel ration long spent. Edmonds, as senior sergeant, was ordered to account for every man under his command. He did so methodically, writing names on scraps of paper scavenged from cigarette packs, keeping them hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The Germans had strict rules. Prisoners could not be punished collectively, yet they could be starved individually. Inspections were frequent and humiliating. Each morning a guard detail entered the barracks, shouting for roll call, counting heads twice, sometimes 3 times, as though numbers could replace humanity. Edmonds understood that in such a place, discipline was life. He enforced the routines of an army, no longer free men standing at attention when counted, sharing rations evenly, saluting the officers who still wore rank by memory. These gestures, meaningless to the guards, became a secret rebellion. To maintain order was to deny the enemy the satisfaction of total surrender. The days settled into monotony. Work details left at dawn, returning after dark with frostbitten hands and stories of bombed-out factories. The distant thunder of Allied air raids was a grim comfort. It meant the war outside was still being fought. Sometimes, at night, the sky glowed faintly from cities burning far away. Then came the rumors. A new order had arrived from Berlin, carried down through the chain of command to every camp in Germany: Jewish prisoners were to be identified and segregated. No one said why. They didn't need to. By 1945 the world already understood what special treatment meant when uttered by the Reich. In Stalag 9A the news spread like frost across the camp. Some men tried to hide their dog tags, which bore a small H for Hebrew. Others filed them smooth against stone or swapped with Christian friends. Fear gnawed at every conversation. Yet amid the anxiety, Edmonds remained steady. He said little, but his silence was a kind of gravity that drew the men together. He had seen enough in the past weeks to know what panic could do. Order must hold, even here. Late one night a guard entered the barracks and handed Edmonds a typed notice. The order was explicit: all Jewish soldiers were to assemble separately at morning roll call. The sergeant read it once, folded it, and placed it in his pocket. Around him the men waited, eyes hollow, breathing shallow. He looked at them and saw not categories or creeds, but soldiers, the same muddy boots, the same hunger, the same hope. No one spoke. The war outside was collapsing, but inside the wire, one decision could still mean life or death. At dawn the bugle sounded. Snow had fallen again, thin and sharp as glass. The men lined up in the yard, breath rising in white plumes. German guards watched from the towers, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. In front of the ranks stood a small group of officers, one of them an SS major sent from higher command to enforce the new order. He waited for the Americans to separate the Jewish soldiers. None moved. For a moment, the silence was total, the kind of silence that precedes violence. Then Edmonds stepped forward. He had no weapon, no authority beyond the obedience of men who trusted him. But he understood that leadership was not granted, it was claimed in the instant when fear demanded retreat. He called the men to remain as one formation. They obeyed without hesitation. The SS major's face tightened. He shouted for the Jewish prisoners to identify themselves. Still, no one moved. Snow hissed lightly against the ground, covering footprints as fast as they were made. The confrontation that followed would be brief but eternal. Edmonds' voice, calm and measured, carried across the yard. His words were not threats but truth. Every man here was an American soldier, he said. If the Germans wanted to kill the Jews, they would have to kill them all. The major's hand twitched toward his pistol. But something in the sergeant's stance, the quiet certainty, the moral immovability halted him. He looked over the hundreds of faces before him, saw that the line would not break, and lowered his weapon. The moment passed like a breath held too long. The SS detail turned and left without another word. That morning, no one was taken away. The camp resumed its grim routine, but the men knew that something irreversible had happened. A line had been drawn, invisible yet indestructible, between obedience and conscience. For Edmonds, there was no triumph, no ceremony. Only exhaustion. He returned to the barracks and sat on his bunk, staring at the frost creeping across the windowpane. He did not think of heroism or history. He thought of the men outside still shivering in the snow, alive because he had refused to bow. The war continued to crumble. German supply lines collapsed, towns fell one after another under Allied advance. In Stalag 9A the guards grew anxious, their discipline fraying. Food rations shrank to almost nothing. But the Americans held together. The knowledge of what had nearly happened bound them with a silent loyalty stronger than rank. By February, distant gunfire could be heard each night. The guards no longer spoke of victory. Their eyes shifted nervously toward the west. Rumors spread of the Americans crossing the Rhine. Liberation, once unthinkable, began to feel near enough to taste. Edmonds made preparations as best he could, organizing the men, keeping records, urging them to conserve strength. He knew that survival was not yet guaranteed. Desperation could still turn the guards violent in their final days. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of red over the wire, he watched smoke rise from a nearby town. It was the same color as the dawn he remembered from Tennessee. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine going home. But he also knew that part of him would never leave this place, that the memory of the yard, the silence, the snow, the hundreds of men standing together would remain louder than any battle. The camp lay at the edge of a valley in Hesse, wrapped in mist that never seemed to lift. Barbed wire cut the landscape into fragments, each section patrolled by guards who walked the perimeter with the mechanical rhythm of men long past compassion. From the watchtowers came the occasional clang of a rifle but against metal, the hollow sound echoing across frozen ground. For the prisoners, time had dissolved into sameness. Morning and evening were distinguished only by the color of the light. Bread was measured in slices thinner than paper. Soup was water with shadows of turnip floating near the surface. Yet even here, amid deprivation, the instinct to live, to organize, to preserve dignity persisted. Sergeant Roddie Edmonds had become the center of that fragile order, his calm voice steadied men who might otherwise have drifted into despair. He inspected bunks for hidden frostbite, divided rations with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, and insisted that everyone shave when possible, using dull blades that drew more blood than whiskers. It was not vanity. It was resistance, proof that they were still soldiers, not slaves. At night, he gathered small groups near the dim warmth of the stove and repeated what little news filtered through the wire. Allied forces had retaken Bastogne. Patton's Third Army was pushing east. The front was moving toward them. Hope was a dangerous thing in a camp, yet Edmonds used it carefully, not as a promise but as a direction. Winter deepened, snow melted during the day only to freeze again by dusk, turning the yard into a landscape of glass. Men slipped, fell, rose again without complaint. Every sound seemed muted, the world holding its breath. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and unwashed bodies. Letters from home arrived rarely and often months late, their edges brown from handling. Some contained photographs folded so many times they had become soft as cloth. The men passed them around, touching faces they would never meet, sharing a kind of collective nostalgia that transcended blood. Occasionally, a Red Cross parcel arrived. It was a treasure chest, powdered milk, chocolate, sometimes a tin of meat. Edmonds divided each box according to need, never rank. He saved one chocolate bar for a man too sick to stand, slipping it under his blanket without a word. Acts like that rippled quietly through the camp, unseen by guards but recorded in memory. The Germans noticed the discipline among the Americans, they found it unsettling. The prisoners saluted, formed ranks, obeyed their sergeant more faithfully than the guards themselves. Order in captivity was a form of defiance, a way to deny the enemy control over the soul even when the body was bound. By February, the sound of artillery had become part of the background, a low thunder rolling from the west. Some nights flashes lit the horizon, far away but visible enough to spark whispers. Liberation was coming, but slowly, like a tide creeping up a beach. The guards grew restless, their uniforms were frayed, their faces lined with sleeplessness. They spoke less of duty, more of home. Some began to barter cigarettes for food, others for news. The line between prisoner and captor blurred in the exhaustion of a war that had already decided its outcome. One evening, as frost thickened on the windows, Edmonds gathered the men. He had sensed a change in the camp's rhythm, an unease spreading among the guards. He reminded the soldiers to stay together, to obey orders only from their own chain of command. The war outside might end at any hour, but chaos within could still kill. Beyond the wire, Germany was collapsing, bridges lay shattered, railways torn apart by bombers. Refugees streamed through the countryside, pulling carts piled with what was left of their lives. Yet inside Stalag 9A, the world remained frozen in a ritual of waiting. Each morning began with roll call. The guards barked numbers, and the prisoners stood motionless, breath rising like smoke. Sometimes the count took hours. Sometimes a man fainted and was kicked until he rose again. Edmonds endured it all without complaint, his face unreadable. He understood that submission here was not weakness but endurance, the patience of stone against wind. On the rare days when the sky cleared, men gathered in the yard to feel sunlight on their faces. It was the only warmth they had. Edmonds often stood among them, silent, watching shadows shift across the snow. He was thinking of home but also of responsibility, the invisible thread that connected each man to the others. A small chapel existed in one corner of the camp, little more than a shed with a wooden cross nailed to the wall. Services were held irregularly, depending on the mood of the guards. Yet whenever they were allowed, Edmonds attended, standing near the back. The hymns were sung in fractured harmony, voices trembling but unwavering. In that sound, fragile and human, he found strength. By March, the camp's routines began to falter. Deliveries stopped. The guards grew thin. The commandant disappeared for days at a time. One morning, the sirens that usually marked roll call stayed silent. The prisoners waited, unsure whether to hope or fear. Then came the first unmistakable sign, the distant roar of engines not German but American. Tanks, faint yet growing louder, the men crowded the fences, straining to see beyond the hills. The guards shouted, firing warning shots into the air, but the balance had shifted. The power that had ruled them for months was dissolving in panic. That night, under a sky streaked with firelight, Edmonds walked the barracks one last time. He checked each bunk, spoke softly to those too weak to rise, reminded them to stay inside until the shooting stopped. The men obeyed without question. Even at the edge of freedom, discipline mattered. When dawn came, the sound of gunfire rolled closer. Then, suddenly, it was inside the valley, sharp, metallic, final. The guards fled. Some threw down weapons and ran, others hid in ditches. Within hours, American troops of the 6th Armored Division stormed the gates. Liberation arrived not with ceremony but with disbelief. The prisoners stepped cautiously into the yard, blinking at the sight of uniforms they had only seen in memory. The stars and stripes sewn on sleeves looked unreal against the gray sky. Some men laughed, others wept. Edmonds simply stood still, watching the flag raised above the gate where the German eagle had hung. In that moment, the months of captivity collapsed into silence, no speeches were made, no medals awarded. The men were too hungry, too hollow, too human for celebration. They were alive, and that was enough. Over the next days, the camp transformed, doctors arrived, distributing food and medicine. Trucks carried the weakest to field hospitals. Interrogations began, documenting names and stories, piecing together the map of survival. Edmonds provided his notebook, every entry precise, every man accounted for. It was the only complete record the Americans found. When asked about the standoff with the German officer, he spoke quietly, minimizing his role. He said only that he had done his duty. The men under his command corrected him, telling the full story to anyone who would listen. Word spread through the division, and soon through the entire army, a sergeant who had saved over 100 lives without firing a single shot. Yet when the war ended, the headlines did not mention him. There were too many heroes, too many tragedies. The world was eager to move forward, to rebuild. Edmonds returned home, demobilized, carrying memories heavier than his duffel bag. He built a life, raised a family, rarely spoke of the camp. The notebooks and dog tags remained in a drawer, quietly preserving a truth that history had not yet noticed. For the men he had saved, however, the memory never faded. They carried it through the decades, the morning frost, the silence, the moment when one man's refusal became their deliverance. Some wrote letters to him, others simply told their children that courage was not always loud. Years later, when historians revisited the records of Stalag 9A, Edmonds' name reappeared. Survivors testified. The details aligned. Slowly, the story resurfaced, rising from the anonymity that had buried so many acts of decency during the war. In the late 20th century, the state of Israel honored him posthumously as righteous among the nations, the only American soldier ever to receive that title. A recognition not born from conquest, but from conscience. In retrospect, the act seemed impossibly simple, a sergeant standing before his captors, refusing to yield. Yet within that simplicity lay the essence of moral resistance. The understanding that humanity, once surrendered, can never be regained by force. Before dawn the camp was motionless, held between darkness and the thin promise of light. Frost rimmed the barbed wire like a necklace of glass. The watchtowers were silhouettes against a bruised horizon. Somewhere a bell clanged once, echoing through the cold. Inside the barracks, breath hung in clouds above rows of sleeping men. It was Sunday, February 1945. The war had become a rumor carried on the wind. No one knew exactly where the front lay anymore. Yet that morning, a new kind of order spread through Stalag 9A, not the routine of roll call or work details, but the quiet preparation of men who sensed that something was about to happen. Sergeant Roddie Edmonds was already awake. He sat on the edge of his bunk, tying the frayed laces of his boots. The notice from the German commandant lay folded in his pocket: all Jewish prisoners will report separately at morning appel. The words were printed, impersonal, almost bureaucratic in tone, but Edmonds understood their weight. They were the beginning of an erasure. He rose and looked around the barracks. Faces watched him from the shadows, men pretending to sleep, others whispering to neighbors. No one needed to ask what he would do. The decision was already made, silent and absolute. Outside, the first trumpet call of roll call shattered the stillness. Guards stomped their boots against the frozen ground, herding the Americans toward the yard. Snowflakes drifted through the gray air, melting as they touched the heat of breath. Columns formed, each man standing shoulder to shoulder, shivering but upright. Across the yard, the German officers waited. Among them stood an SS major in a black greatcoat, his peaked cap gleaming with frost. He carried a pistol on his belt and a list in his gloved hand. The prisoners were ordered to separate by group. Edmonds stepped forward and faced his men. His voice, when it came, was low but steady, the tone of command learned on Tennessee drill fields and now tempered by months of captivity. He gave a single order: form up. All of you. They obeyed instantly. Instead of a handful of names, hundreds of men filled the yard, forming ranks that stretched almost to the wire. The SS major looked up from his list, surprised. The translators muttered, uncertain. The snow thickened, muffling the world into stillness. The major barked again, demanding the Jews step forward. None moved. The moment held. Every man could hear the click of the officer's boots as he crossed the snow. He stopped before Edmonds. The two men stood eye to eye, one armed, one unarmed, the difference between power and courage exposed in the breath that steamed between them. The major's command came sharp, the voice of a machine trained to obedience. Edmonds' reply was quiet, human, final. Every man here was an American soldier. He said it once, clearly, without hesitation. We are all Jews here. The words fell into the cold like stones dropped into water. Ripples spread through the ranks, not of sound, but of realization. Each prisoner understood that the statement had left the realm of metaphor. It was literal. He had made their fates one. The SS major's face tightened. He drew his pistol, leveling it at Edmonds' head. For a heartbeat, the only movement in the yard was the rising vapor of breath. 100 men watched the barrel of the gun tremble slightly, saw Edmonds standing motionless, eyes fixed not on the weapon but on the man holding it. History records battles by casualties. It rarely records the moments when no one fires. Yet here, the war paused. The German hesitated, caught between ideology and the recognition of another soldier's authority. The pistol did not lower, but neither did it fire. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, slowly, the major turned the gun aside. He looked over the assembled Americans, the identical coats, the steady faces, and realized he could not separate them without killing them all. He barked a final order to dismiss. The guards hesitated, then obeyed. The ranks broke, the prisoners shuffled back toward the barracks, silent except for the crunch of snow underfoot. The confrontation was over in minutes, but its echo filled the camp for the rest of the war. The Germans never again demanded names, the list disappeared, word spread quietly through Stalag 9A, then through neighboring camps. An American sergeant had defied the SS and won. The story passed from mouth to mouth like contraband, a spark of dignity smuggled through fences. That day, Edmonds said little. He sat alone outside the barracks, watching flakes settle on his gloves. The adrenaline had drained, leaving only exhaustion. Around him, the camp resumed its grim rhythm, roll call complete, work details dispatched, guards pacing the wire. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, something irreversible had changed. The men he had saved tried to thank him, he waved them off. Gratitude embarrassed him, duty did not. In his view, the line he drew had been obvious. A soldier's responsibility extended beyond orders to the preservation of what made the uniform worth wearing. Still, when he looked at their faces that evening, faces uncounted because he had refused to count them, he felt a quiet relief so deep it could not be spoken. The next weeks blurred together. The front moved closer, the air raids louder. At night, flashes lit the horizon like distant lightning. Each rumble was a heartbeat of hope. The guards' tempers frayed. Some drank openly, others disappeared into the woods. The commandant, once proud in his blue-gray coat, now avoided the prisoners' eyes. The Reich he served was collapsing faster than his orders could arrive. Through it all, Edmonds maintained the same routine: roll call, ration distribution, care for the sick. He kept the men together because unity had already proven its power. If one act of solidarity had saved 100 lives, then order itself could save the rest until liberation came. In the last days of March, the thunder of American artillery rolled through the valley. Shells landed close enough to shake the barracks walls. The guards argued among themselves, their authority unraveling hour by hour. Prisoners were told to stay indoors, no one obeyed. They stood at the windows, watching columns of smoke rise from the hills, recognizing the pattern of their own army's advance. On April 4, 1945, tanks of the 6th Armored Division reached the gates. The battle for the camp lasted less than an hour. When the Americans entered, the guards had fled. The prisoners poured into the yard, half believing the scene was a dream. Freedom, after months of captivity, felt unreal, a concept too large for bodies so thin. A correspondent traveling with the liberators wrote that the men at Stalag 9A were calm, organized, almost military in bearing. They credited a sergeant who had kept them that way. Edmonds himself refused interviews. He was busy accounting for his men, ensuring the wounded were evacuated first, the dead recorded by name. Only when the last truck rolled out did he allow himself to sit down. The officer who liberated the camp asked him what had happened with the SS major. Edmonds shrugged, unwilling to embellish. He had a gun, he said. I had my men. The reporter wrote it down, but the story was lost amid thousands of others. The war was ending everywhere at once, history had more noise than it could hold. Still, among those who had witnessed it, the memory remained indelible. They told it years later at reunions, in letters, in the quiet hours of old age. Always the same image, a frozen yard, a pistol raised, a man refusing to move. To some, it seemed impossible that such defiance could succeed. Yet the truth lay not in the size of the act but in its simplicity. The SS major had power, Edmonds had conviction. Power depends on fear, conviction does not. After liberation, the surviving prisoners scattered across Europe, then home. Many changed names, changed lives. Some found faith, others lost it. But whenever they spoke of the war, one phrase returned again and again: he stood for us. It was not rhetoric, it was literal. Years later, when researchers traced the roll books of Stalag 9A, they found no list of Jewish prisoners for February 1945. The column was blank. The paperwork of genocide had been interrupted by a single man's refusal. That blank space became Edmonds' monument, not marble, not bronze, but absence, the absence of death where death had been planned. In hindsight, historians compared the event to the larger movements of the war, the fall of Berlin, the liberation of Dachau, the raising of flags on Iwo Jima. Yet in scale it was microscopic, one morning in one camp. Its significance lay precisely in that smallness. The Holocaust was built on the idea that individuals did not matter. Edmonds proved that one individual could undo the logic of annihilation, even if only for an hour. When he returned to Tennessee, he carried no medals, no public recognition. He married, worked as a watch repairman, lived quietly. The men he had saved sent Christmas cards, letters, photos of their children. He answered every one. Only after his death decades later did his son find the notebooks and the testimonies that would resurrect the story. In 2015, 70 years after that frozen morning, Roddie Edmonds was named Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem. In the ceremony, a survivor stood beside his son and said, "Your father saved my life." The words echoed the cadence of a roll call, names once threatened now spoken freely. The war ended not with a single sound but with the slow unspooling of noise into quiet. Artillery faded first, then engines, then the scattered echo of rifle fire that had marked Europe's heartbeat for 6 unbroken years. What replaced it was a kind of stunned stillness, a continent trying to remember what ordinary mornings were supposed to feel like. In that silence, millions began the long work of counting the missing, graves were opened, registers compiled, cities mapped by absence. For many, the measure of victory was survival itself, and among the countless soldiers returning west from captivity, one name passed in whispers, the sergeant from Tennessee who had faced the SS and refused to break. Roddie Edmonds stepped onto American soil in the spring of 1945 carrying nothing but a uniform that no longer fit and a duffel bag filled with notebooks. He did not speak of what had happened in Stalag 9A. His homecoming photographs show an ordinary man, thin, smiling awkwardly, the war already folding itself into the lines around his eyes. He returned to the rhythm of small-town life, church on Sundays, family dinners, the steady ticking of the watches he repaired for a living. The world called such men veterans. He thought of himself as lucky. For the soldiers he had saved, luck was not the right word. Each year that followed carried the echo of that February morning, a moment when a single sentence had stood between them and extinction. They wrote to him, visited when they could, bringing their children to meet the man who had once spoken for them all. He accepted their gratitude with embarrassment, as though they were mistaken. "We just did our duty," he would say, a phrase worn smooth by repetition until it became part of his quiet armor. America was busy looking forward, factories humming, highways uncoiling across the map. The old Europe of snow and wire receded into black and white memory. Stories of combat filled newspapers, stories of conscience rarely did. Edmonds never corrected the imbalance. He believed that silence could protect what words might cheapen. Decades passed, the men of the 106th Division aged, their reunions shrinking in number each year, yet whenever they gathered, someone would raise a glass to the man who had kept them whole. They spoke not of weapons or victories, but of a yard covered in snow and a voice that had not trembled. Memory became ritual, and ritual became history. When Edmonds died in 1985, the story almost died with him. The notebooks remained in a drawer, brittle with age, the pencil faint but legible, names, units, dates, the accounting of lives preserved. Only later, when his son Chris opened them, did the full picture emerge. Letters from former prisoners arrived like ghosts returning home, each confirming the same impossible event. Piece by piece, the mosaic reformed. Historians traced the documents, interviewed survivors, compared testimonies, the details aligned too perfectly to be legend. Stalag 9A, February 1945. An SS major. A pistol raised. A sergeant who refused. 100 men alive because he would not separate them. In 2015 the evidence reached Jerusalem, and the name Roddie Edmonds entered a record older than any nation's, the roll of the righteous among the nations. The ceremony at Yad Vashem was small, solemn, bright with winter light. The flag of Israel hung beside that of the United States. Survivors stood beside the sergeant's son. Their faces, marked by age, still carried the same quiet strength as the photographs from the camp. When the citation was read, there was no applause, only silence, the same silence that had once filled a frozen yard in Germany. Out of it came a single sentence, spoken softly by a man whose life had been spared 70 years earlier. He was a soldier of humanity before he was a soldier of any army. Recognition changed nothing for Edmonds, he had never sought it. Yet the story's return mattered for reasons beyond one man. It reminded a forgetful world that resistance is not always measured by gunfire or banners, that sometimes the most enduring victories occur in moments no camera records. Across archives and classrooms, his name began appearing beside those of rescuers who had risked everything without violence, people who understood that obedience ends where conscience begins. Scholars called it moral courage, veterans called it leadership. His son called it faith in uniform. If one studies the photograph taken outside the camp after liberation, the meaning becomes clearer. The men stand in uneven rows, thin as shadows, yet there is a unity in their stance, the muscle memory of that morning. Behind them the guard towers are empty. The snow has melted into mud. What remains is posture, the physical echo of defiance. History often forgets the quiet ones, it remembers explosions, not pauses, heroes who charge, not those who stand still. But the weight of silence is heavier than noise. In that silence lies choice, to see or to turn away, to speak or to remain mute. Edmonds chose to speak, and by doing so gave voice to 100 others who might never have spoken again. The landscape of Europe has long since healed, the barbed wire was pulled down, the barracks dismantled, the valley planted with fields that bloom each spring. Visitors walking there today might find nothing to mark where the line once stood. Yet if they listen carefully, they might sense it, the faint rhythm of boots in snow, the pulse of hundreds breathing as one, the echo of a pistol not fired. What endures is not the event but the example, that courage can be ordinary, that dignity can be defended without hatred. That a single refusal can outweigh 1,000 commands. For every generation that rediscovers this story, the lesson remains the same. Power is temporary, conscience is permanent. A soldier's oath is to protect life, not merely to obey. And sometimes the battlefield is a place with no weapons at all, only the space between two human beings and the truth they refuse to betray. When the lights dim in a museum exhibit or a classroom film, and the narrator's voice fades, there is always a pause, the audience waiting for the final image. In this story, that image is simple. A winter morning. A man standing still. Snow falling on the brim of his cap. Behind him, 100 men alive because he would not step aside. That is the whole of it. No gunfire. No glory. Just the sound of silence carrying farther than any weapon ever could.